So, to start, we've got Katherine Crosman from SINTEF, who's going to give us our plenary talk. Katherine.
Hi, I'm Kate Crosman. I am, as noted, working at SINTEF Ocean, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit this morning with some introductory remarks on sustainability, society, and science. I'd like to start first by telling you a little bit about myself and where my interest in these topics comes from. So back in my misspent youth, I spent about 10 years living and working as a scuba diving instructor on a small island off the coast of Thailand. And during the time I was there, I saw massive development of that island. So tourism took off, absolutely exploded. And with that came, as you can imagine, certain environmental costs. But there were also massive socioeconomic benefits to be gained from that. And I loved to see the second of those, and I hated to see the first, and it left me with this internal value conflict and this sort of intellectual pickle that I sat with for a few years until it finally drove me back to school. And I went to graduate school with one burning question, which was, could we do this better? Can we get those benefits and minimize those costs, or maybe even eliminate them? Could we conserve and protect unique ecosystems while we're doing it? And for me, most importantly, because my background, my disciplinary background, is in public policy and governance, could we do that in a way that is supported by those who benefit from the development and who have to live with the cost? Because if it's supported or even driven by the people, then we internalize the change we want to see, and that will help that change really stick. So now I'm with SINTEF Ocean, where I work indeed as a social science researcher. I use social science methods to understand and engage with stakeholders and their perceptions of, support for, and buy-in into ocean and coastal management and sustainability. I won't lie to you, I don't know a lot about decommissioning offshore structures, but I do know a lot about the systems within which those conversations about decommissioning take place. And I'm still asking those same questions about how can we do this better in terms of values, costs, benefits, and trade-offs. And I really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak with you and tell you some of what I've learned and some of the things I'm still thinking about. So it will come as a surprise to no one in the room or with us online that we alter our oceans and coasts. Sometimes we do it on purpose, as is the case here with this artificial reef. You can't see, it's probably electrified to combat the effects of climate change and encourage the growth of corals. And sometimes, of course, we alter our marine and coastal environments unintentionally. That is the case with this shipwreck, which admittedly is in the Great Lakes. It's open access picture. And that is nothing new. We have been altering our ocean and coastal environments since time immemorial. So on the left here, you can see these are Hawaiian fish ponds, right? So this is traditional aquaculture in Hawaii. And on the right here, you can see Coast Salish clam gardens in the Pacific Northwest of the United States and Canada, where mariculture of clams was a traditional practice. So all of this is to say that the baselines that we are starting at now are already shifted, and they are shifting. So we're hitting a moving target. The human footprint on our oceans and coasts is simply irreversible. There is no going back to some kind of pristine state, pre-human impact. If you'll forgive me, that ship has in fact sailed. We can only choose how to move forward. And everybody in this room, as you know, or I hope you know, has a super important role to play in charting that path forward from these shifted and shifting baselines. Let's talk a little bit about what I think that role is. Well, let's start first by acknowledging that we are not without guidance. We have just a plethora of high-level frameworks, global and regional agreements, and shared initiatives that frame our desired future. In addition to, for instance, the SDGs or the Decade of Ocean Science, we just had the UN Oceans Conference in Nice, and at UNOC, we saw the announcement of the European Ocean Pact, in which the EU dedicates €1 billion for ocean conservation, science, and sustainability. We saw the joint declaration on a plastics treaty, which has been long elusive. The Plastics Treaty Joint Declaration was signed by 90 governments, calling for a legally binding treaty that includes controls on production of plastics. And we saw momentum on the race for ratification of the UN Agreement on Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdictions, the BBNJ Agreement. We're now at 50, at least a few days ago it was 50, maybe now it's 52, I don't know, but a few days ago it was 50 of the necessary 60 ratifications to get the BBNJ agreement to enter into force. So this, for me, is great news. Like me, the global community cares about sustainable use of the oceans. We wish to continue to derive benefits from the oceans while minimizing costs. And all of these agreements share a few other commonalities. Specifically, decision-making should be grounded in science. Sustainability should be understood to comprise 3 pillars: environmental, economic, and social. And with that commitment to social sustainability comes a renewed focus on social equity and the equity impacts of the decisions that we make. But we have all of these aspirational, high-level value statements, and yet it doesn't always feel like we're making progress. It sometimes actually feels like we're heading in the wrong direction. Actively choosing sustainability is difficult for a lot of reasons. Let's start with the systems that structure decision-making, because those create and are subject to their own constraints, incentives, and rules. Economic and political power and control of information are concentrated in ways that we haven't seen probably since the beginning, the invention of the printing press, right? This high concentration in just a few hands of this kind of power is problematic because the power holders, those at the very top, they really benefit from the way things are and from doing things the way we've been doing them. That's how they got into power. Even for those who really are truly driven by a desire to commit to sustainability, political and economic realities can still challenge radical action. The institutions that we live under themselves, these institutions that structure how we make decisions and implement decisions, well, they resist change. We say in policy studies that institutions are sticky. And what we mean by that is that institutions are embedded in social structures that themselves resist change. So you can't just change an institution. You have to pull all of society along with you, and that's hard to do. And I think we probably all know that bureaucracies are very slow-moving. Now, these kinds of systems provide stability, but they do make widespread lasting change challenging. We have access to more information than almost ever before. Well, certainly, more information than ever before, but our information ecosystems are rife with uncertainty. We have well-intentioned people sharing conflicting information, and we have bad actors who are manipulating information ecosystems to drive their own desired ends and to increase their own power. Narratives combined with information really matter. So for today, for instance, I know we're going to hear or see posters about biofouling and artificial reef effects and habitat creation for marine invasive non-native species. From where I stand, that's 3 different ways of saying more or less the same thing. But the story that you tell when you talk about creating an artificial reef versus biofouling, it's very different flavor, right? So control of language and terminology also reinforces power. So it's not surprising that sometimes we get stuck. Yes, the systems that we live under challenge change, but we can't solely blame the systems because sometimes our own approaches to contention also challenge change. Sometimes the way we approach contention results in forward movement, and sometimes it results in stalemate. Let's talk a little bit more about that. So, if we think about the example of the decommissioning of offshore structures, we can think of many contrary positions and a lot of different values. I was told there was going to be a fire alarm. Please do not panic. We will just wait this out. Hooray, no fire. I had forgotten all about it, so I'm glad that, yeah, good. I'm glad you guys told me that was going to happen. Okay, so multiple conflicting values and positions in conversations around decommissioning. So what do I mean when I say values and positions? Well, positions are intransigent. Positions are, there is only one solution. A position is a stance. Let's take the example of the Brent Spar. Greenpeace took a position. They took a very strong position that there was only one right solution to decommissioning that facility, and that was to do it onshore. They were very successful in communicating and defending that position, and that has had far-ranging consequences for decommissioning regulation in the North Sea. Positions seem really obvious if they're the position that you hold, and they seem absolutely infuriating if that is not the position that you hold. Contrary positions are irreconcilable. There is nowhere to move from a position because it is a stance. Values, on the other hand, are what we really care about. They're what is underneath or behind the position. And when we talk from values, it's possible to uncover common ground. So Greenpeace, behind that position, probably was working from values that many of us share, pro-environmental values that really prioritize a clean, healthy ocean and the protection of marine ecosystems. But we were stuck with positions. Confusing positions with values can really hinder forward movement when forward movement is in fact possible. Contention over values is constructive, and contention over positions tends not to be. I would argue, in fact, that contention over public values is necessary for a democratic society to respond to the needs of its members. Because if we're looking to make progress, we have to know progress towards what? And to know progress towards what, we have to know what we care about. So famously, German philosopher Jürgen Habermas coined the term the public sphere. And he defined the public sphere as fora in which people inclusively criticize and engage and identify problems and discuss and debate and identify common understandings and maybe even consensus on what matters and what needs to be done to achieve social project. Then these conversations are reflected to the state, to the apparatus of government, which acts accordingly. In this model, we as a society decide what we care about, and the state acts to realize those values. In Habermas's time, the public sphere really was like a coffee house. In our time, we could think of an internet comment board, we could think of letters to the editor, we could think of protest marches. Now, there are clear limitations of each of those in terms of whether or not it truly constitutes a public sphere. And it's not hard to identify ways in which we have diverged pretty far from the ideal of public values driving decision-making, which, as we have already noted, are mediated by power, money, and control of information. But again, we do have this shared baseline. This baseline reflects a certain set of values. We've already identified them. Resource use is necessary, and it should be environmentally, economically, and socially sustainable. Decision-making should be based on science, and equity matters. And from this shared baseline, we can measure progress. So we can operationalize these things that we care about into things that we can measure. And of course, what we care about and what we can measure is both subject to trade-offs and may change with context. So in the context of decommissioning, we see contention over economic values. We see tension between a desire for profit and growth and a desire for sustainability and circularity. Well, maybe circularity, that's arguable. We see tension in the ecological realm between anthropogenic stances, in which humans set themselves as separate from the ecosystem and somehow superior to the ecosystem, and ecocentric stances, in which people understand themselves to be embedded in and subject to broader ecological networks. And in the social sphere, we see tensions, for instance, between the desire to honor and preserve history and culture, and a desire to innovate and create the new. So what do we measure to support conversations and decision-making about decommissioning? Well, you probably all know that much better than I do, so I'll just give you a few things that I came up with. Economic values. We might measure costs, decommissioning costs, and they might vary by what approach to decommissioning we choose. We might measure the value of reclaimed or recycled materials from offshore structures. And we might measure new opportunities associated with decommissioned structures. So for instance, this could be the economic value of recreational fishing in the Gulf of Mexico, or it could be taking your oil platform and turning it into a dive resort, as is the case in Malaysia. I believe it's Malaysia, this picture. In ecological values, we can measure reef effects or biofouling, depending on how you want to spin it. We can measure the disturbance that's caused by removing offshore structures from the ecosystem. And we can measure the ecological costs of decommissioning in place or at sea in terms of an increased, longer-standing presence of habitat for invasive species, or in terms of microplastic generation, which is, I know, another topic that we will be covering during these days. And with social values, we can measure interactions with other culturally important activities. So I mentioned recreational fishing in the Gulf of Mexico. You can imagine that there are values that are hard to monetize associated with traditional recreational fishing. If you grow up in Louisiana, that's part of who you are. It's not just about the money, it's part of who you are. It has a cultural value to you. We can measure view sheds, not just in terms of hedonic pricing, how much does my house value go down when suddenly I can see windmills, but what does it do to my psychological health to not be able to see an unobstructed view of the sunset any longer? And we can discuss how to identify and value these trade-offs between different sorts of pillars of sustainability. I know you're all thinking, wow, this is a lot of hand-wavy social science stuff, so what about science? What about science? So why don't we just get the outcome that science tells us is the right outcome? Because after all, as scientists, we know the right answer. Well, I would argue that science can inform contention, and it can explore trade-offs, and it can provide guidance on what is necessary to achieve desired outcomes, but it cannot decide what our desired outcomes are. That is not the role of science. The technically optimal solution is not always the right solution, because the right solution depends on what we value. Furthermore, science is embedded in society. We don't exist outside of society. Science is not omniscient. At best, it's a low-resolution reflection of part of reality. The old all models are wrong, some models are useful. And as scientists, we bring our own lenses and biases to what we examine. And as scientists who are also human beings, sometimes it's hard for us to recognize that. It's hard for us to recognize that we bring biases to our inquiries and what those biases are. So I would argue that the stance that the scientific solution is the correct solution is a position. That is a stance. And if you find yourself holding that stance, I would simply ask you to think about what values are behind that, because that's where the movement is, the possibility for change. So here we're back at values again. It's not just a matter of better specifying the study or doing the math. The different dimensions of sustainability mean that we are comparing apples and oranges. Gains and losses are incommensurate. We can develop new, exciting methods to measure and compare trade-offs, but those themselves are based on value judgments, and we should recognize that. The correct answers, again, come down to what we value and what we're willing to trade for it. So where does that leave us as scientists? Well, we have a crucial role. We should provide the science upon which decisions can be based. Policy that is influenced by science. It's one of our big social goals. I'm really looking forward to hearing more from all of you and during the poster sessions on what that science says and learning more about that. But importantly, we should remember that it is our role to support decision-making, not to sort of reign supreme with the way that we believe things should be done. So in practice, consideration of economic and environmental values is, albeit incompletely, institutionalized already in our decision-making systems. So the incentive structures and regulatory environment in which developers exist institutionalize economic values to influence decision-making. Environmental values are institutionalized in most places through the use at the bare minimum of environmental impact assessment. Science can help. Science can better specify those values. They can better measure changes and predict changes. Social values are a little bit trickier. They're less generalizable, I would argue, and they can be more difficult to measure, and sometimes they're not even really quantifiable. By quantifying them, we're sort of removing so much of the richness and dimensionality that we're really interested in. So science can still be useful here to improve our understanding, but to address these values, ultimately, scientists and science need to respond to decision-maker and stakeholder needs. So to the extent that we as scientists hope to go away and do our science and come to the correct solutions to the problems we've identified, and then share those solutions one way with stakeholders and decision makers, and then sort of bemoan their unwillingness to do what we told them, we do ourselves a disservice. And I don't just mean ourselves as scientists, I mean ourselves as members of society. We are part of that big we. We are part of the public sphere. Science can contribute to decision-making for a sustainable society through stakeholder engagement that is not just one-way communication or marketing of our results to increase public support, although there is a role for that, a very important role for that. Science can go one step further and engage with stakeholders and decision makers in service of the 3 pillars of sustainability: And we can do this by being inclusive and by co-creating work that responds to socially determined priorities. So we need to work cooperatively to identify the problems we want solved and the questions we want answered, and the path forward. And if you don't know what that looks like, you are not alone. And I know a whole bunch of social scientists who would be eager to collaborate with you on that. So interdisciplinary work is really crucial in this space as well. I would also suggest that as scientists, we need to embrace our role as members of the public, and we need to explicitly engage in the public sphere. We need to bring our knowledge and our expertise to those conversations where we contend over values. And we need to be transparent about the values that we bring to those conversations and avoid getting locked into positions, because values are where the movement is. That will help us take active part in creating a sustainable future for our society. So in sum, as we continue to engage in conversations about decommissioning offshore structures, and indeed all ocean sustainability, I will echo very much what Dickon opened with. Let us be creative and inclusive and collaborative. Let us maintain a little bit of humility and engage in cooperative learning and doing in service of sustainability as scientists and as people. Thank you.